Under the shadowed chandeliers of Buckingham Palace, a storm was brewing, not of politics, not of diplomacy, but of bloodlines, history, and the glittering symbols of a monarch's legacy. It was the kind of storm that doesn't howl through corridors with the whistle of wind, but creeps in silently, shaking the walls with whispered words and stolen glances. Those who have walked the palace halls for decades swore they had never felt such tension, not even in the days following the late Queen Elizabeth II's passing. It began, as so many palace scandals do, with a single sentence uttered in the wrong place at the wrong time. Queen Camilla, consort to King Charles III, allegedly leaned into a private conversation, one meant for trusted ears only, and declared words that would ripple through the monarchy like a stone dropped into still water. The Queen's private jewelry collection is mine by marriage. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Those words, so brazen and so final, struck like a slap across the face of royal tradition. To the uninitiated, they might seem harmless, a mere assertion of a wife's rights to her husband's inheritance. But for those who understood the sacred division between the personal and the institutional in the House of Windsor, this was no idle claim. These jewels were not mere accessories. They were threads woven into the very fabric of Britain's royal identity. The private collection was unlike the crown jewels, which belong to the state and are guarded in the Tower of London. This was something far more intimate, an array of priceless pieces, many gifted directly to the late Queen by world leaders, tokens of diplomacy, tributes of respect, and, in some cases, deeply personal gestures. A diamond necklace from a Middle Eastern ruler, an emerald tiara from a foreign queen, sapphire earrings from a president's wife. These were more than adornments. They were silent witnesses to decades of alliances, friendships, and moments when Elizabeth's quiet smile disarmed the world's most powerful men and women. Now, according to whispers leaking from behind those gilded doors, Camilla wanted them. Not for the crown, not for public display, but for her own family, her grandchildren, her bloodline. For some, the audacity of the claim was almost admirable in its boldness. For others, it was an unforgivable breach, an attempt to strip away a part of Elizabeth's identity and place it in the hands of those with no royal claim. But for King Charles, it was something far more personal. It was a challenge to the delicate balance he had spent a lifetime trying to protect. Behind closed doors, sources say Charles's reaction was swift and severe. In his mind, the jewels were not simply property. They were memory, duty, and an unspoken promise to his late mother. He had stood beside her through decades of ceremonial pageantry, knowing each gem told a story. To see them passed outside the crown's reach was, for him, unthinkable. The days following Camilla's alleged statement were a masterclass in quiet warfare. No shouting matches echoed through the corridors, no public statements betrayed the growing rift. Instead, the battle unfolded in subtle ways. The absence of Camilla from certain meetings, the tightening of Charles's schedule, the sudden cancellation of a joint appearance. Those who knew how to read the signs could see it plainly. This was not the usual marital disagreement. This was a clash that could alter the monarchy itself. The public, of course, was only given crumbs at first. A single tabloid headline hinting at tensions over royal heirlooms. A morning talk show whispering about Camilla's controversial claim. Social media began to churn, with hashtags like #NotYoursCamilla and #Queen'sLegacy trending in the UK. People dug up photos of the jewels in question, sparkling tiaras on state visits, brooches worn at wartime memorials, and posted them alongside captions like, "These belong to Britain, not you." Yet for all the noise outside the palace gates, the real drama was playing out in the silence between two people who had once united against the fiercest storms of public opinion. Charles and Camilla had survived decades of scandal to reach the throne together, but now, over a glittering set of heirlooms, their bond was straining in ways neither had predicted. What drove Camilla to make such a claim? Was it greed, as some would say? Or was it sentiment, the belief that as the king's wife, she was entitled to the intimate tokens of the monarch's private life? Some within her circle claimed she saw herself as the rightful custodian of these treasures, believing her grandchildren should inherit them just as naturally as William and Harry would inherit their father's and grandmother's belongings. Others whispered darker motives, that she sought to cement her own family's place in royal history, carving out a legacy independent of the Windsor line. Whatever her reasons, they were colliding headlong with centuries of royal protocol. British monarchs had long operated on a principle that blurred the lines between personal and state property, but one rule was clear. Items gifted to a reigning monarch in their official capacity typically remained with the crown, not their spouse or family. To break from that tradition was to risk undermining the monarchy's claim to represent the nation, not a single family. And yet, Camilla persisted. Insiders say that in private discussions, she refused to budge. She allegedly argued that marriage, especially one to the sovereign, inherently merged personal possessions. If Elizabeth had been given those jewels, then by virtue of marrying Charles, she had inherited them. It was a bold stance, but one that seemed to ignore the delicate legal and symbolic scaffolding on which the royal family's legitimacy rested. Charles, for his part, was no stranger to difficult decisions. His reign was young but already marred by the constant balancing act between modernizing the monarchy and protecting its traditions. Here, though, the choice was stark. Allow Camilla to proceed, and he risked a public perception of self-interest and favoritism. Stop her, and he faced a deeply personal rift with the woman who had been his confidant and partner through the most trying years of his life. It was a dilemma without a gentle resolution, and as the days wore on, it became clear to those around him that Charles was leaning toward the unthinkable. Removing Camilla not only from the jewels, but perhaps from her role as queen consort entirely. The gravity of that possibility hung over every room they entered together, casting a shadow over even the most formal of smiles. The moment that decision crystallized, the instant Charles crossed from hesitation to resolve, is still shrouded in palace secrecy. But those present at a certain late-night meeting recall the tension in the room as nearly suffocating. Camilla, poised but firm, repeated her position. Charles, voice low but unwavering, made it clear that her claim would not stand. What followed, insiders say, was not an argument but a breaking. A line crossed, a trust fractured. Outside, the public still waited for the truth to spill out. Inside, the corridors of Buckingham Palace seemed to echo with a strange emptiness, as if even the walls sensed the shift in power. The Queen's jewels, so small in size, yet so massive in meaning, had become the fault line on which the royal marriage now trembled. And in the midst of it all, a question lingered over Britain like a storm cloud. When love and legacy collide, which one survives? This was no longer just a dispute about gemstones. It was about the soul of the monarchy, the nature of inheritance, and the price of standing one's ground in the most scrutinized marriage in the world. And before long, the whole world would know just how high that price could be. The Queen's private jewelry collection was not simply a treasure trove of diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, and rubies. It was, to those who understood the monarchy, a living, glittering diary, a chronicle of friendships, alliances, victories, and even quiet acts of defiance. To the casual observer, they were ornaments. To the late Queen Elizabeth II, they were symbols of a life lived at the intersection of history and duty. Unlike the crown jewels, which are enshrined in tradition, guarded in the Tower of London, and used only for the grandest state ceremonies, the private collection belonged to Elizabeth personally, or so the long-standing understanding went. But even that definition was nuanced. The pieces were often gifts from world leaders and foreign dignitaries, some handed over during moments of diplomatic significance, others offered in quiet gestures of friendship. Each one had a story, and together, they formed a tapestry that told more about her reign than any official archive could. The famous sapphire tiara from King Khalid of Saudi Arabia was not just a lavish token. It marked a time when the Queen's diplomacy bridged a delicate relationship between Britain and the Middle East. The Burmese ruby and diamond necklace, presented by the people of Myanmar, was not merely a display of craftsmanship. It was a deeply symbolic gift intended to protect the Queen from illness and evil, steeped in local tradition. Then there were the smaller, more intimate pieces, a brooch from a president's wife during a quiet lunch at Windsor, a diamond bracelet from a fellow monarch with whom she had shared decades of camaraderie. These jewels rarely sat idle. They accompanied Elizabeth to state banquets, adorned her during official portraits, and occasionally even brightened her presence at less formal events. Photographs spanning 70 years of her reign show these pieces shimmering under every type of light, from the warm glow of Buckingham Palace's ballrooms to the harsh flash of modern press cameras. They were part of her public image, yes, but also part of her private comfort. She knew the weight of them, the history they carried, and the eyes they had dazzled. Royal historians often point out that the distinction between a sovereign's private possessions and crown property has been a murky one. While there are documented wills, legal provisions, and family agreements, much is governed by custom. In Elizabeth's case, discretion was paramount. She rarely spoke publicly about her personal collection, and there were no grand statements declaring their future. This, perhaps, was the root of the current storm. The ambiguity that allowed Camilla to interpret the situation in her own favor. The late Queen's private collection was also guarded in secrecy. Few outside the closest circles of royal staff had seen it in its entirety. The pieces were stored in secure vaults when not in use, their exact inventory known only to trusted custodians. To the public, they were occasional delights when worn. To the monarch, they were personal anchors, touchstones to moments in her life that defined her reign. It wasn't just the sparkle or the monetary value that made them priceless. It was what they represented. They were reminders of the Queen's ability to wield soft power with grace. A diamond tiara worn to meet a foreign leader was more than decoration. It was a statement. Wearing a particular brooch during a visit to a former colony could carry subtle political weight. Even the choice of earrings could send a message, deliberate or otherwise, to those who knew how to read them. This is why the thought of the collection leaving the hands of the crown and passing into the personal safekeeping of Camilla's family was so shocking to those who understood the stakes. If these jewels were scattered, gifted to people with no connection to the Windsor legacy, their historical significance would be diluted, their symbolism lost to private ownership. Pieces that had once been worn in rooms where history was made could end up locked in a safe in a country estate, their stories fading away. There is an undeniable emotional element here, too. For Charles, these were not just things his mother had accumulated. They were part of her essence. He had seen her wear them through good times and bad, had watched her pair certain pieces with specific occasions as though they were talismans. The thought of them leaving the royal fold was, in a sense, like watching his mother's life being dismantled, gem by gem. It is easy to understand, then, why the idea of possession over these jewels is not a mere legal debate. It is a question of identity. Who gets to carry forward the memory of a monarch whose reign spanned more than 7 decades? Camilla's claim, therefore, is not just a statement about marital rights. It is a direct challenge to the unspoken understanding that the Queen's personal legacy should remain tied to the institution she devoted her life to. The public fascination with these pieces has always been intense. Magazines, documentaries, and royal exhibitions have fed the appetite of those eager to see the treasures up close. But the fascination is not purely material. For many, each jewel is a fragment of Britain's national story. The fact that some of them may have been worn in meetings that altered the course of history only deepens their allure. And so, the chapter of the Queen's private collection is not merely about gold and gemstones. It is about memory, politics, heritage, and power, all contained in objects small enough to rest in the palm of a hand but powerful enough to stir an empire's emotions. In the days before the current controversy, these jewels quietly sat where they had for decades, waiting for the next chapter in their story. No one outside the Queen's immediate circle knew exactly how she intended them to be passed on. And perhaps that was her greatest oversight, for in that uncertainty, she left the door open for the boldest of claims to be made. When Camilla's alleged words emerged, the Queen's private jewelry collection is mine by marriage. They hit with the force of a hammer striking glass. Suddenly, this discreet, almost mystical collection was thrust into the center of a public and deeply personal tug-of-war, its history and its future hanging in the balance. It was one thing for Queen Camilla to harbor a private belief about the fate of the late Queen's personal jewels. It was another entirely for that belief to leave the safety of whispered conversations and enter the bloodstream of palace politics. The moment those words crossed her lips in the wrong company, they became more than an opinion. They became a scandal in waiting. The alleged scene unfolded in one of the smaller private drawing rooms at Clarence's house. The day had been filled with the usual swirl of royal duties, receptions, and ceremonial obligations. Camilla, still in her formal attire, was said to be speaking with a small cluster of confidants. A trusted aide, a distant relative, and a family friend who had long moved in royal-adjacent circles. The conversation, according to the source who later leaked the account, turned to the Queen's passing and the practical matters left behind in her wake. It was here that Camilla, in a tone that struck some as matter-of-fact and others as startlingly bold, made her now infamous declaration. The Queen's private jewelry collection is mine by marriage. The words were delivered without apparent hesitation, as if she were stating something entirely obvious. In her mind, the argument was straightforward. She was the wife of the reigning monarch, and as such, what was privately owned by the late Queen was now privately owned by the King, and therefore accessible to her. But those who heard the remark didn't all interpret it as simple logic. Some were stunned into silence. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the deep breach this position could create with both the public and the royal family itself. A member of the gathering reportedly attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere, but the sentence had already lodged itself like a thorn in the fabric of royal propriety. The leak was not immediate. For several days, the remark lingered in the minds of those who had heard it. Some dismissed it as an offhand comment, the sort of thing that would fade into memory without consequence. But others, aware of the treasures in question and the deep symbolic value they held, could not let it go. Eventually, one account found its way to a well-connected royal correspondent who recognized the potential magnitude of such a statement. The journalist approached it carefully at first, probing sources in the palace to confirm the claim. What they found was not outright denial, but a series of carefully worded responses that seemed more focused on avoiding comment than refuting the story. In royal communications, the absence of a denial can speak volumes. Within a week, whispers began surfacing in the press. A short paragraph buried in the Society pages hinted at new tensions between the King and Queen over the late monarch's private heirlooms. A popular talk show host brought it up in a light-hearted segment, framing it as another royal family squabble before the conversation quickly veered elsewhere. But beneath the surface, the story was gaining traction among those who knew the weight of the words. Inside the palace, the reaction was swift but quiet. Senior aides began holding discreet meetings to assess the potential fallout. Charles, who had initially hoped to resolve the matter privately, was now facing the reality that Camilla's comment, whether accurately reported or not, was becoming a matter of public record. His advisors warned him that once the media fully latched onto the story, it would be nearly impossible to control the narrative. Camilla's inner circle, for their part, saw the growing ripples as an overreaction. To them, her statement was nothing more than a rightful assertion of her position. Some even suggested that the leak was a deliberate act by those within the palace who had never fully accepted her as queen consort and sought to undermine her standing. If that was the case, the tactic was working. By the time the tabloid press caught wind of the precise wording, "mine by marriage," the story exploded. Headlines were splashed across newsstands. Camilla's jewelry claimed Shock's palace. Social media erupted with debate. Some defended her, pointing out that in most marriages, personal property is indeed shared. Others were outraged, arguing that these were not ordinary possessions, but items of deep national and historical importance. Public opinion began to polarize almost instantly. Supporters saw her as a woman standing up for her rights within a system that often placed her in the shadows. Critics saw her as opportunistic, attempting to seize what had been entrusted to the monarchy as a whole. Hashtags like #HandsOffTheJewels and #Queen'sLegacy began trending on platforms, while satirical memes depicted Camilla as a pirate plundering a treasure chest. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Reports suggest that Charles confronted Camilla in private, urging her to issue a clarification or even a partial retraction to calm the storm. But Camilla allegedly resisted, maintaining that to backtrack would make her look weak, and worse, imply she had been wrong. For a woman who had spent decades weathering public criticism, the thought of voluntarily retreating from her stance was unthinkable. Camilla, for her part, remained defiant. According to those close to her, she saw the backlash not as a genuine defense of tradition, but as yet another example of the resistance she had faced since the day she entered royal life. She believed that her detractors were using the jewels as an excuse to undermine her position and tarnish her reputation. In private, she was said to have remarked that they would never have treated the Queen Mother this way, a statement that underscored the generational and emotional weight of the dispute. The longer the argument lingered, the more entrenched both sides became. Palace insiders described tense silences during meals, abrupt changes in tone during official engagements, and a growing awareness among staff that they were witnessing the unraveling of something significant. This was not a mere disagreement over possessions. It was a battle over the very definition of what it meant to be queen consort in the modern age. In the court of public opinion, the lines were just as sharply drawn. Commentators debated whether Camilla's claim was a bold assertion of her rightful place or an audacious overreach. Legal experts appeared on news programs, dissecting centuries of royal precedent. Social media was awash with impassioned posts, some laced with humor, others with anger. The divide was not just about the jewels. It was about who the monarchy belonged to, the family who occupied the throne or the nation whose history it carried. In the end, the argument over law versus tradition was not something that could be settled in a courtroom or by a quiet handshake. It was playing out in the open, under the unblinking gaze of the public, and every day that passed without resolution only added to the weight pressing down on the king and queen. The breaking point for King Charles did not arrive with a single, dramatic outburst. It was a slow erosion, a steady wearing down of patience, composure, and the quiet reserve that had always been his armor. For weeks, he had tried to keep the matter contained, to shield it from the public eye, to address it with calm, deliberate conversation rather than confrontation. But the more he tried to bring the matter under control, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. Charles had inherited from his mother not only the throne but also the belief that the monarchy must rise above personal squabbles. He knew the crown survived not through brute power but through dignity, ritual, and the perception that it existed for the good of the nation. Every decision he made was weighed against this unspoken rule. That was why this dispute over the jewels cut so deeply. It wasn't just a disagreement with his wife. It was a threat to the image of the monarchy itself. Behind closed doors, the conversations with Camilla had grown more tense. At first, he had approached her with reasoning, pointing out the historical precedent, the symbolic value of the collection, and the damage her claim might do to public trust. He had reminded her, gently but firmly, that these were not ordinary heirlooms, but pieces tied to the dignity and continuity of the crown. She had listened, but her replies always circled back to the same point. She believed she was entitled to them, and she was unwilling to back down. What Charles found most difficult was the tone of her resolve. This wasn't a heated quarrel that could cool with time. It was a firm, deliberate stance, one she seemed determined to hold even in the face of his objections. According to palace insiders, there were moments when she appeared almost incredulous that he could disagree with her so strongly. After all, wasn't she his wife? Hadn't they weathered storms together that had nearly broken them both in the court of public opinion? But Charles could not ignore the other voices in his ear. Senior advisors, family members, and even old friends had begun to press him with quiet urgency. Some reminded him that he had already spent much of his early reign working to win public approval after years of scrutiny over his marriage to Camilla. Others warned that if the perception took root that the monarchy was being used for personal gain, it could open the floodgates to criticism far beyond this single issue. The Queen's collection, they argued, was about more than jewels. It was about trust. To allow them to be claimed as private spoils would undermine the monarchy's moral authority, and moral authority was the bedrock upon which the entire institution stood. The strain began to show in Charles's demeanor. Those who worked closely with him noticed the subtle signs: a clipped tone in meetings, moments of distraction during ceremonial duties, a heaviness in his expression when cameras weren't looking. His private secretary reportedly adjusted his schedule to give him more time away from public engagements. But even then, the weight of the situation followed him. Camilla, too, was feeling the pressure. Friends say she resented the implication that her motives were selfish or opportunistic. She had spent decades being portrayed in the worst possible light by segments of the media, and now, just when she had begun to find her footing as queen consort, she felt she was being painted as a usurper. This, in her eyes, was not just about jewels. It was about respect, position, and the principle of being recognized as a legitimate partner in the monarchy. The private moments between them grew shorter and more strained. Meals that had once been filled with comfortable conversation turned quiet. In public, their interactions were as polished as ever, but those who knew them well could sense the shift. It wasn't open hostility. It was the absence of the easy warmth that had defined their partnership in recent years. The turning point came during a private meeting attended by Charles, Camilla, and a handful of the king's most trusted advisors. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. The advisors laid out, in clear terms, the legal research they had gathered. Piece by piece, they explained the origin of the jewels in question, the nature of the gifts, and the historical record that tied them to the crown. They spoke not with emotion but with precision, as though delivering a legal judgment. Camilla listened, her expression unreadable, and when they finished, she simply restated her claim, calmly, firmly, without the slightest sign of concession. "I am not asking for the crown jewels," she is said to have remarked. "I am asking for what was hers, and what is now my husband's. I will not be made to feel like a thief for that." It was in that moment, according to one aide present, that Charles's patience finally gave way to something harder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out. But his reply carried the finality of a closing door. He told her, in words that left no room for misinterpretation, that the jewels would remain under the care of the crown and would not be dispersed to her family. It was not a suggestion. It was a decision. What followed was a silence that seemed to stretch forever. Camilla, by all accounts, did not argue further in that meeting. But her expression, cool, guarded, and unyielding, told Charles everything he needed to know. This was no truce. It was merely the pause before the next move. In the days that followed, Charles began to distance himself from her, at least in the context of palace operations. They still appeared together at certain public events, but behind the scenes, she was excluded from discussions about the jewels and related matters. Some interpreted this as the king asserting control. Others saw it as the early signs of a marital separation in all but name. For Charles, the decision was both necessary and deeply painful. This was the woman he had fought to be with, the partner who had stood beside him during some of the darkest chapters of his life. But now, in the role of monarch, he was being forced to choose between that partnership and the preservation of his mother's legacy, and by extension, the credibility of the monarchy itself. In quieter moments, those close to him say he looked tired, even older than his years. The strain was undeniable. Yet in his mind, there was no other path. To yield would have been to risk the very foundation of the institution he had sworn to uphold. And so, the king reached his breaking point, not with a shout, but with a line drawn in the sand, one that could not be crossed without consequence. Prince William had always understood that the monarchy was as much about perception as it was about power. From the time he was a boy watching his grandmother command a room with little more than a smile, he learned that the real strength of the crown lay in its ability to embody stability, unity, and tradition. Now, as heir apparent, he could see that the dispute over the late queen's private jewelry collection was threatening all three at once. When news of Camilla's claim first reached him, William was reportedly both stunned and unsurprised. Stunned because of the sheer boldness of the statement, claiming pieces so steeped in history and symbolism as personal property, and unsurprised because he had long been aware that Camilla's approach to her role differed sharply from his grandmother's. To William, the jewels were more than ornaments. They were a living archive, meant to pass down through the sovereigns of the future, not to be dispersed into private hands. William's support for his father's stance was immediate and unequivocal. He did not hide his belief that the jewels should remain part of the crown's possession, available to future monarchs for ceremonial duties. Those close to him say he framed the matter not just as a legal or traditional issue, but as a moral one. These pieces had been entrusted to the monarchy, not to any one individual. If they were allowed to leave the royal fold now, it would set a dangerous precedent. Prince Harry's reaction, however, was more complicated. Though his relationship with the institution had been strained for years, and he had stepped away from official duties, Harry still carried deep emotional ties to certain aspects of his heritage, particularly anything connected to his grandmother. The idea that the jewels, many of which had been worn during some of her most significant moments, might be removed from the crown's collection struck a personal chord. Yet Harry's position was less about upholding royal tradition and more about honoring the memory of the woman who had been a constant in his life. He reportedly told confidants that while he had little interest in the jewels themselves, he could not stomach the idea of them being used to benefit people with no connection to the Windsor line. To him, that felt like erasing part of his grandmother's story. Still, Harry was also aware that his own complicated standing with the family made it risky to speak out too forcefully. Any public statement from him could be interpreted as self-serving or opportunistic. This left him in a difficult position, quietly agreeing with his father and brother's stance, but hesitant to insert himself into what was rapidly becoming an internal war. Other members of the royal family reacted with varying degrees of dismay and disbelief. Princess, and ever the pragmatist, was said to be firmly against Camilla's claim from the outset. To Anne, who had always embodied the ethos of duty over personal gain, the idea of taking personal ownership of such items was unthinkable. She saw the jewels as tools of statecraft, not possessions to be hoarded or gifted away. The Duke of Edinburgh's relatives, though more removed from the central power structure, also expressed unease in private conversations. Many of them had vivid memories of seeing the Queen wear these jewels during state occasions and family gatherings, and the notion that they could end up in the hands of people entirely outside the royal lineage felt like a betrayal of both history and family honor. Behind the scenes, these shared concerns began to knit together into a quiet but powerful front of opposition. While no one wanted to create the appearance of ganging up on the Queen consort, the consensus was clear: the jewels must stay within the crown's possession. Even those with little affection for Charles personally understood that on this matter, the king's position was aligned with the survival of the monarchy's image. For Camilla, this mounting opposition within the family was a bitter pill. She had spent years navigating the minefield of royal politics, gradually earning a degree of acceptance among senior members. But this dispute seemed to undo much of that progress. It was not merely that people disagreed with her claim. It was that they saw it as crossing a line between personal ambition and public responsibility. Tensions began to seep into even the most formal occasions. At a reception in the palace gardens, observers noted that William and Camilla exchanged only the most perfunctory pleasantries. At another event, Princess Anne's cool demeanor toward Camilla was caught on camera, sparking speculation about the depth of the rift. Meanwhile, the press feasted on every scrap of information. Headlines pitted the heirs against the consort, framing the story as a battle for the heart and soul of the monarchy. Tabloid covers featured side-by-side photos of William and Harry in military regalia juxtaposed against images of Camilla wearing some of the very jewels in question, with captions questioning who would ultimately control them. For Charles, the family's unified front on this matter was both a source of strength and a complication. On one hand, it reinforced his position that the jewels should remain with the crown. On the other, it left Camilla increasingly isolated, making any reconciliation between her and the rest of the family more difficult. The optics were becoming harder to manage, and the sense of fracture was visible to anyone paying close attention. In private, William urged his father to stand firm, warning that backing down would be seen as weakness and could embolden others to make similar claims in the future. Harry, though more reserved in his involvement, was said to have offered quiet words of support, telling Charles that he was doing the right thing for their grandmother's memory. Even as these internal dynamics played out, the public's interest only grew. Polls suggested that a significant majority of Britons sided with Charles and the heirs, believing the jewels were part of the nation's heritage and should remain under the care of the monarchy. This gave Charles political cover to take a harder line, but it also made any path toward compromise with Camilla all the more narrow. By the time the family gathered for a private dinner intended to ease tensions, the atmosphere was already set. Conversation was polite but stilted, and the subject of the jewels hung over the table like a ghost neither side was willing to acknowledge openly. It was clear that the dispute had become more than a disagreement over property. It was now a fault line running through the royal family itself, threatening to shape its future in ways none of them could yet predict. The story broke in full force on a Monday morning, the kind of day when the news cycle usually starts slow, dominated by weather reports and political chatter. But this time, within minutes of the first headlines hitting the airwaves, the public mood shifted like a sudden storm rolling in from the North Sea. The leading tabloids splashed the story across their front pages with screaming headlines about Queen Camilla's alleged bid to claim the late Queen's private jewelry collection. The phrase "mine by marriage" was now everywhere, attached to her name like an unshakable shadow. It was the perfect scandal for the modern media ecosystem, a blend of wealth, tradition, betrayal, and family politics, all wrapped around an object the public could picture vividly: glittering, priceless jewels tied to their beloved late monarch. Television networks cut into regular programming to cover it. Morning talk shows brought in royal commentators to speculate on the palace fallout, and radio call-in lines were flooded with listeners eager to voice their outrage. The reaction was swift and polarized. On social media, hashtags like #Queen'sLegacy and #HandsOffOurHistory began trending within hours. Some posts were sentimental, showing side-by-side images of Queen Elizabeth wearing her famous brooches and tiaras, paired with captions pleading for their preservation in the crown's collection. Others were scathing, accusing Camilla of opportunism and greed. Memes appeared almost instantly, photoshopped images of her wearing a pirate's hat, or sitting atop a hoard of treasure like a dragon guarding gold. Not all voices were critical. A smaller but vocal contingent defended her, pointing out that in most marriages, a widow or widower inherits their spouse's possessions. They accused the media of unfairly targeting Camilla and claimed that her critics were motivated by lingering resentment toward her role in the breakdown of Charles's first marriage to Diana. But even among these supporters, there was unease about the optics. By midday, international outlets had picked up the story. In the United States, morning shows framed it as a battle over royal loot. European broadcasters, especially in countries with their own monarchies, treated it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blurring the line between personal and state property. In the Commonwealth nations, where the monarchy's relevance is increasingly questioned, commentators seized on the controversy as evidence that the crown was out of touch with the modern world. Palace officials scrambled to contain the narrative, issuing a carefully worded statement that neither confirmed nor denied the claim but emphasized the king's commitment to preserving the late Queen's legacy. The statement, while intended to calm the waters, only fueled further speculation. Reporters began dissecting every word, interpreting the lack of outright denial as proof that the heart of the story was true. Public outrage began spilling over into real-world action. Outside Buckingham Palace, small groups of protesters gathered with signs reading "Not yours, Camilla, and return the people's jewels." While the gatherings were modest in size, they attracted significant media coverage, reinforcing the perception that the public was united against her claim. Retailers selling souvenir replicas of the Queen's most famous jewels reported a surge in sales, as if the public were collectively trying to hold on to a piece of the monarchy they feared was slipping away. Bookshops dusted off old biographies of Elizabeth, placing them in their front windows alongside glossy photo collections of her wearing the disputed pieces. It became not just a political issue but a cultural moment, a way for people to reaffirm their connection to a figure they had lost less than a year earlier. The media firestorm was further fueled by the emergence of leaked quotes from unnamed palace insiders. One source described the king as deeply disappointed and privately furious about the claim. Another suggested that senior advisors were urging him to take a hard line, even if it meant a public rupture with Camilla. Whether these leaks were genuine or strategic plans from within the palace, they kept the story alive and guaranteed it remained front-page news for days on end. In talk show studios, royal commentators began to openly discuss the possibility of Camilla's position as queen consort being weakened or even revoked. While few believed Charles would take such a drastic step, the mere suggestion was enough to send shockwaves through the public discourse. Radio debates became heated, with callers trading accusations of misogyny, entitlement, and betrayal. By the end of the week, the story had moved beyond gossip and into the realm of national conversation. Politicians were asked for their opinions during interviews, with some refusing to comment and others cautiously aligning themselves with the idea that national heritage must remain in national hands. A few outspoken MPs even suggested that the government should step in to ensure the jewels stayed within the crown's possession, a proposal that raised complex constitutional questions. Meanwhile, the palace press office was inundated with requests for clarification. They responded by doubling down on their line that the matter was private, a choice of wording that only deepened the sense of secrecy and suspicion. The public, sensing that something was being hidden, became even more determined to press for answers. For Camilla, the media storm was relentless. Every public appearance became an exercise in scrutiny, every smile interpreted as smugness, every silence as guilt. Even when she attended events unrelated to the controversy, photographers shouted questions about the jewels, ensuring that her image was tied to the scandal no matter the occasion. The king, too, was under pressure. His advisors urged him to make a definitive statement to end the speculation, but he resisted, fearing that any public acknowledgement would cement the story as one of the defining moments of his early reign. Instead, he tried to ride out the storm, even as it became clear that it was eroding both his public image and his marriage. The media firestorm was no longer just about who would possess the jewels. It had evolved into a referendum on the nature of the monarchy itself. Whether it was an institution bound by duty and history, or simply a privileged family guarding its own wealth. And for the first time in decades, that question was being asked not only by critics of the monarchy, but by its staunchest supporters. If there was one thing Camilla had learned over the years, it was that survival in the royal sphere required a dependable circle. People she could trust implicitly, who would not only support her, but actively defend her when the winds of public opinion turned cold. During this latest storm, that circle closed ranks tighter than ever, operating behind the scenes to reinforce her position and keep her resolve intact. Her inner circle was a mixture of long-standing friends, a handful of aristocratic allies, and trusted staff members who had been with her long before her marriage to Charles. These were individuals who had weathered her most difficult years, from the aftermath of her affair becoming public to the slow, painstaking climb toward public acceptance as the Duchess of Cornwall and eventually Queen Consort. They knew her instincts, her temperament, and her deep aversion to what she perceived as being treated like a second-class figure within the monarchy. Within this group, there was a shared belief that the backlash against her jewelry claim was not truly about the jewels at all. They saw it as the manifestation of old grudges, remnants of a time when Camilla's very presence in the royal family was seen as a scandal. In private conversations, they voiced the suspicion that certain factions within the palace, perhaps even within the family itself, were using the dispute as an opportunity to undermine her standing. And so, the discussions inside her camp turned strategic. If the fight was inevitable, they reasoned, then it should be fought on her terms. According to palace sources, Camilla's closest advisors encouraged her to frame the matter as a family inheritance issue rather than a public or constitutional one. By shifting the narrative away from national heritage and toward personal rights, they believed she could erode some of the outrage and win sympathy from those who saw the monarchy as a family first and an institution second. It was during these private strategy sessions that rumors began to emerge, whispers that Camilla intended not just to keep the jewels, but to gift them to her own grandchildren. This was never stated publicly by Camilla herself, but the mere suggestion was enough to intensify the public backlash. To her detractors, it confirmed their worst suspicions, that she was trying to divert pieces of royal history into the possession of a bloodline unrelated to the House of Windsor. The jewels in question were not random baubles. Among them were pieces that had been worn by Elizabeth at pivotal moments in her reign. A diamond tiara she wore during her first state visit to France, a pearl necklace she had chosen for the opening of Parliament, and a collection of brooches gifted by leaders of Commonwealth nations. If these were to be removed from the royal vaults and passed into private hands, they could vanish from public view forever, their historical significance reduced to family keepsakes with no guarantee of preservation. Camilla's allies, however, argued that this was a natural and reasonable intention. In their eyes, just as William and Harry would one day inherit personal possessions of the Queen and the King, Camilla's grandchildren, the children of her son Tom Parker Bowles and her daughter Laura Lopez, had just as much right to receive items of sentimental value from their grandmother. They bristled at the suggestion that the Windsor bloodline should have exclusive claim to every possession tied to the late Queen, especially those that had been privately gifted. Behind closed doors, these debates grew more pointed. Camilla reportedly confided to her closest friends that she had no intention of letting her grandchildren grow up entirely outside the legacy of the monarchy. She was acutely aware that in the eyes of the public, they were not royal, and never would be, but she also knew that history could be rewritten by what was handed down. A necklace worn by a queen consort could one day become a family legend, a link between her descendants and the history of the crown, even if they never held titles or performed official duties. This line of thinking was deeply unsettling to Charles. For him, the monarchy's legacy was not something that could be parceled out along personal lines. It belonged to the institution and to the nation it served. The idea of jewels tied to his mother's reign being removed from royal circulation and placed into the safekeeping of Camilla's family was, in his mind, incompatible with the role he had sworn to uphold. The rumors about her intentions spread quickly, in part because they were too tantalizing for the press to ignore. Reporters dug into the backgrounds of Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, photographing them in public, speculating about their lifestyles, and even interviewing acquaintances for any hint of how they might handle such treasures if they were to inherit them. Some articles painted them as entirely unconnected to the monarchy. Others hinted at quiet ambitions to hold on to the family's growing royal association. The effect on public opinion was immediate. If the initial outrage over Camilla's claim had been about preserving national heritage, this new angle transformed it into a personal grievance for many Britons. It was no longer just about who legally owned the jewels. It was about whether someone outside the Windsor line should have the right to benefit from them. For monarchists, the thought was sacrilege. For Republicans, it was a potent talking point in their broader argument against the institution's existence. Inside her circle, Camilla remained resolute. Friends say she took the outrage as proof that she was being targeted not because of her actions, but because of who she was. She believed that any other queen consort in history would have been allowed to quietly take possession of such items without a public word being spoken. The difference, she maintained, was that her critics had never truly accepted her place beside the king and were seizing on this as the latest excuse to push her out. The king, meanwhile, was growing increasingly concerned about the political implications of her stance. The royal family had been working for years to stabilize its image after a series of scandals, and the early years of his reign were meant to be a period of quiet strength and unity. Now, the headlines were filled with division, and the very person who was supposed to be his partner in representing the monarchy was at the center of the storm. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, staff whispered about how far Camilla might be willing to push this. Was this simply a personal battle she refused to lose, or was it the opening move in a larger effort to carve out a more independent identity within the monarchy? If the latter, it could have consequences far beyond the fate of a few glittering heirlooms. One thing was certain. With every day that passed, the dispute was becoming less about the jewels themselves and more about the question of loyalty, legacy, and the true nature of Camilla's role as queen consort. Whether she intended it or not, the perception was taking root. She was not just challenging the king's authority, but the unwritten rules that had bound the monarchy for generations. History has a way of echoing through the halls of monarchies, and the British crown is no exception. While the dispute between King Charles and Queen Camilla over the late Queen's private jewelry collection seemed unprecedented in its modern intensity, it was far from the first time a royal spouse had laid claim to treasures that blurred the line between personal property and national heritage. The difference now was that the entire world could watch the drama unfold in real time, magnified by a relentless media cycle. To understand why Charles was so immovable on this matter, and why Camilla's stance was seen as so provocative, it's necessary to look back at the historical patterns of inheritance disputes within the monarchy, the moments when royal consorts, widows, and widowers tried to assert their rights over property that had both personal and political weight. One of the earliest examples that royal historians point to is the controversy surrounding Queen Alexandra, wife of King Edward VII. Upon Edward's death in 1910, Alexandra retained possession of certain jewels and gifts that many in the court believed should have passed directly to the new queen, Mary of Teck. Alexandra argued that some of these items had been personal gifts to her, not the crown, and therefore she was entitled to keep them. The dispute caused tension between the two women, straining their already formal relationship. In the end, a quiet compromise was reached, but only after months of behind-the-scenes negotiation, and even then, the transfer of certain items was delayed until Alexandra's own death. Then there was Queen Mary herself, who became known for her meticulous approach to preserving the crown's collection. After the death of her husband, George V, she went to great lengths to ensure that jewels with historical significance remained in royal custody. She was famous for retrieving pieces that had been given away or sold by other members of the family, sometimes causing friction but always defending her actions as necessary for the preservation of the monarchy's heritage. In Mary's view, no personal claim could outweigh the needs of the institution. Perhaps the most instructive case, however, came in the mid-20th century with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. When King George VI died in 1952, the new Queen Elizabeth II inherited not just the throne, but also the expectations surrounding the royal collection. The Queen Mother kept certain jewels for her own use, most notably the Greville, tiara, and other pieces gifted to her personally. But there was a clear understanding that these items would pass back into the royal vaults upon her death. It was a delicate balance between personal possession and custodianship, one that maintained public trust while allowing for some private enjoyment. The common thread in all these cases was discretion. Whatever disputes occurred were handled quietly, often out of the public eye, and any resolution was framed in a way that emphasized unity rather than division. The monarchy understood that its survival depended as much on appearances as on actual policy, and a public quarrel over property was seen as damaging to the image of harmony and dignity that the crown sought to project. This is precisely why Camilla's claim was so explosive. By the time her alleged statement, "The Queen's private jewelry collection is mine by marriage," reached the press, the matter was already stripped of the privacy and nuance that had protected earlier disputes. Instead of hushed discussions between courtiers, it was now the subject of hashtags, talk shows, and tabloid headlines. What might once have been resolved quietly had become a full-scale public confrontation, one that risked casting the monarchy in a light of greed and division. It also broke with the precedent of consorts deferring to the sovereign or the sovereign's heir when questions of heritage arose. In the past, even when a consort felt strongly about their rights, they often yielded to the greater good of the crown, or at least did so publicly, while arranging private concessions. Camilla's refusal to step back was seen by many royal watchers as a dangerous departure from that tradition, one that could weaken the monarchy's authority over its own history. Royal commentators drew parallels to other European monarchies where similar disputes had erupted. In the Dutch royal family, for instance, there had been arguments over the fate of jewels that had belonged to Queen Juliana, with her descendants divided over whether certain pieces were personal property or state treasures. In Spain, questions about the disposition of Queen Victoria Eugenie's jewels had led to quiet but tense negotiations among her heirs. The lesson from these cases was clear. Once the matter becomes public, resolution becomes exponentially more difficult. For Charles, the historical precedent was not just a cautionary tale. It was a guide for action. He knew that allowing Camilla's claim to stand would mark a sharp break from the patterns established by his predecessors. It would suggest that personal entitlement could override the collective responsibility to safeguard the monarchy's legacy. That, in his mind, was unacceptable. Camilla, however, saw history differently. In her view, the examples of Alexandra, Mary, and the Queen Mother proved that consorts could and did retain possession of significant items after the death of a monarch, and that the definition of personal versus state property was not fixed but negotiable. She believed that just as those women had been allowed to keep certain treasures, she too should be entitled to make her own determinations about the jewels. The problem was that the context had changed. The monarchy was now operating in an era of unprecedented transparency, or, at least, unprecedented exposure. Social media meant that even the smallest leak could reach millions within hours. Every move, every gesture, every perceived slight could be frozen in a photograph and dissected in online forums. What might once have been an internal matter was now a global talking point. As historians and commentators dug deeper into the parallels, the public's understanding of the dispute became more complex. Some began to question whether Camilla was truly breaking precedent or simply continuing a long tradition of royal consorts protecting what they saw as their personal inheritance. Others, however, argued that even if precedent existed, it didn't make the action right, especially when the items in question carried such powerful national symbolism. What made this dispute different from any that had come before was not just the jewels themselves, but the stakes for the monarchy's image. In earlier centuries, the crown could weather internal disputes without fear that they would permanently damage public perception. In the 21st century, however, image and trust were everything. A single misstep could lead to calls for reform, or worse, abolition. By the time the historical parallels had been thoroughly discussed in the press, one fact was clear. This was no longer just a fight between a king and his queen consort. It was a test of how the modern monarchy would interpret its own traditions, how it would reconcile the private desires of its members with the public's expectation of stewardship. And unlike the disputes of the past, this one had no hope of remaining in the shadows. It was unfolding in the glare of a global audience, and every move from here on would be judged not only against the actions of past royals, but against the standards of a world far less forgiving of royal privilege than ever before.